No, I just wanted to say that one of the principles that I think in terms of stress is that if you have one or two things to worry about that you find stressful, most people can handle that. But moving, you think it's only going to be two, maybe three, but guess what? It compounds, and there's
Uh-huh.
surprises that you don't control. And that's I have a lot of compassion for people who have to move.
Marriott's on the move.
What?
Marriott's on the move.
Again?
Marriott's on the move.
Not anymore. I'm Mariette of Marriott's on the Move, and I'm finally setting roots back in Sweet Home Chicago. But if you're thinking about moving, I'm on it. I've moved 20 times in the last 24 years to 6 of America's top cities, and boy, do I have some stories for you. I'll be doing some on-air coaching and, of course, giving you my tips, tricks, and scams to avoid. This is the Moving Tips and Tricks podcast. Now let's get moving. Welcome to the Moving Tips and Tricks podcast, everyone. I am your host, Mariette Fry, and I am super excited for today's episode because I have Dr. Maggie Baker here with me. And after 35 years of practicing psychology, Dr. Maggie Baker is well seasoned dealing with transitions, especially concerning finances. She has been focused on financial therapy for the last 20 years, and if you've never heard of financial therapy, it's a practice where she helps clients improve their relationship with money by becoming aware of their long-held beliefs, attitudes, and emotions regarding finances. So Dr. Baker lives in the Philadelphia area. She's 5 minutes away from her son's family and her 2 granddaughters, Haley and Molly Claire. And I think she's a really fun grandma because for fun, she sings in her church choir, but she also enjoys indoor rock climbing. So I think that's the coolest thing. And she also wrote this awesome book. If you're on YouTube, I'm putting it up right now so you can see it. It's called Crazy About Money that I am more than halfway through. It has been such an easy read. It's all about teaching you finance through stories, which I have had so many epiphanies since starting this book. So it's going to be a really, really fun interview today. So Dr. Baker, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to pass on my well-seasoned wisdom to all of your listeners. And particularly, I have a lot of compassion for what's involved with moving, since my son and his family just moved from Denver to Philadelphia. And my goodness, the surprises that came along with that move were quite stunning.
Yeah. So what happened? Now I want to know.
They're pretty well organized, but I don't care how organized you are. There are things that happen, like they were in the process of selling their house and they didn't know whether it was going to sell. And they had somebody who was interested, and then they disappeared. And then they got somebody else, and they weren't sure that they were going to take it. And ultimately they did. There were screw ups with the bank. They had 2 mortgages until the sale was complete. They didn't know when the closing was going to be. So they lived in a pool of uncertainty, and it was stressful enough leaving their jobs, leaving their friends, leaving the kids' schools and going somewhere else. The only saving grace is that Alec was coming home, and he knew what he was getting into by living here. But his wife didn't know, and she had grown up in Colorado. And so she was anxious about whether she would really fit and belong and whether she could get a job, because neither of them had tied up a job yet.
Oh, wow.
Oh, and then when they got here, the house that they thought that was going to be just fine, they ended up talking to the neighbors, and the neighbors said that the guy who was selling it was a scammer and had a criminal record, and by the way, left a big hole in the roof that they didn't see the first time. And they were just about to sign the contract. And fortunately, they didn't. So the whole thing, actually, I think they did sign the contract, but one of his best friends from home was the real estate agent, and he worked very hard to cancel the contract even after it was signed, because there were so many things that were wrong with the deal.
Wow.
And
As
then
if
he
it's not
found
stressful
a house
enough
for them. I
Yeah.
know, I know.
Wow.
And can you imagine, getting all excited and then going out talking to the neighbors and saying that he was basically a criminal?
Wow. That is so scary.
No, I just wanted to say that one of the principles that I think in terms of stress is that if you have one or two things to worry about that you find stressful, most people can handle that. But moving, you think it's only going to be two, maybe three, but guess what? It compounds, and there's
Uh-huh.
surprises that you don't control. And that's I have a lot of compassion for people who have to move.
You have to be very adaptable. And I think that no matter how prepared you are, things are always going to throw you off. And unless you can kind of roll with it and know that these are things that are going to happen, like you just have to be prepared on how you're going to handle it. Like you're either going to get mad or you're just going to let it ride. And I always say, like, in situations where it feels very difficult, like, what if it were easy? What would that look like? Like saying that in the moment, like, okay, what if this was easy? What would that look like? And then verbally processing what that would feel like if it was easy. Cause man, there are situations that you could just never even imagine that come up when you're moving. So goodness.
Well, I don't want to do an advertisement for Viking cruises, but if I had if I were in that position, I'd say, Viking cruise, come help me.
Calgon, take
And
me
they would
away. Do
know
you
how
remember
to
that
do it.
commercial? Yeah,
Right, right. Take me
exactly.
away, take care of me, and you do it.
Mhm. I love it. Well, I mean, you've had decades as both a clinician and a research. So, like, what first drew you to specialize in financial therapy? Was there a particular moment that, you had, or a client told you a story that was like, this is a focus I need to focus on? How did that come about?
Well, most of what I've done in my life has been generated by my own personal experience. And when I turned about 50, my husband had really taken care of the finances up to that point,
Yeah.
but he didn't really like doing it. And I thought the way he did it, I I didn't like. Just to give you an example, he was so aversive about it that one day I went into his office, and as I was just coming to the door, he kind of sheepishly looked at me, and I thought, "Uh-oh, something's
Uh-oh.
going on here." So
Yeah.
I go in, and I see him about ready to put a $25,000 tax bill, on a credit card because it was due the next day, and I thought, "Oh my g this is no way to manage your personal finances." So, long story short, we had a big talk, and I said, "Well, why don't you let me handle it, because I'm more pragmatic and, I like dealing with other people, and you're more academic." And, that conversation went on, and I took over and started to quote, "straighten things out," which was great until 2000 came along. I thought I was doing a pretty good job, and I changed financial advisors to somebody who was much more engaged and more aggressive. And
Yep.
as a result, and I tried to protect myself as much as possible, but I got very overinvested in technology stocks, and then of March of 2000, they plummeted, and
Yeah.
I lost several $100,000, and
Oof.
that loss sent me into about a year and a half's worth of depression, which was
Mm.
really, really hard because, like many women, I blamed myself. I kind of privately took it in and used kind of a psychic whip on myself because I'd, screwed up so much. And
Yep.
eventually, about a year and a half later, I remember being in the shower and watching the water just freely come down out of the shower head. And I started to envy the water,
Aw.
but it also got me crying. I just sobbed and sobbed, and, I became a waterfall. And
Yeah.
somehow that freed me to act, which I hadn't been able to do because, it feeds into a sense of helplessness and vulnerability and worthlessness. Well,
Yeah.
I put on my roller skates and joined a financial investment club. I learned how to analyze stocks. I fired the guy that I was working with, and I found
Good.
somebody that was much more conservative. And I said, get me diversified. I want to have the most diversified portfolio you've ever managed. And the other thing is that I had tried to do some stock picking and everything myself through the club. And that was a very valuable experience. But, do the stock picking and taking care of your own portfolio is so laden with a sense of emotional responsibility that I think that throws you off. And I know, according to the research, people that have financial advisors are far more resilient in the end than people who don't. So I was very, very lucky. I found somebody who was conservative, who understood what I wanted, who did what I wanted. And um, right now I'm in a really, really good situation thanks to his hard work and to my speaking up about what I really wanted that would make me feel financially secure.
Well, I imagine that's why if you are participating in financial therapy with someone like you who has been through it and understands it, it probably is very liberating to be able to talk freely about that shame and that, because I think money is something that we should be learning starting in kindergarten. And we're just expected to know some of these things. And, it's kind of a travesty on our U.S. schooling. But at the same time, it is kind of your responsibility to figure it out. So if somebody is, unfamiliar with financial therapy, what does that actually mean? Like tell me what happens. How is that different than like a financial advisor that you went to or like psychotherapy?
Well, what I do is to help people understand what their deeply held beliefs are about money and their attitudes about money that they may be partially aware of, but not aware enough to change their behavior. And I'll give you a concrete example of somebody who was an entrepreneur, and he had a business that he started, and he was very engaged with the business. But as it grew, he got more and more detached and bored.
Mm,
And he thought to himself, well, I'm just bored and detached. I'm going to start a second business that will really excite me. So he starts a second business. And lo and behold, after a few months, both of them started to falter. And he got very, very scared because, oh my gosh, here I am, an entrepreneur, and I've got two failing businesses. And that's what brought him into therapy. And what he learned was that as a child, he thought his parents were poor and he was growing up poor because they were pretty strict about money. But the most important thing is, they taught him the facts and figures of money. But what they didn't teach him was the emotion that went with the money.
mm,
So that, for instance, if his mom got a credit card bill at the end of the month and she either started to scream or sob, he obviously could feel her upset, which was transmitted to him. And he didn't know, oh, we must be poor because she gets
yeah.
so upset. That was the connection that he made. And maybe what I want is also causing them hardship. So maybe I shouldn't want what I want. And it all goes underground because he doesn't know that he's feeling these things because a 7-year-old doesn't have a capacity to reflect, but
Yeah.
they're embedded in his psyche. So
Yep.
what 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 we unearthed in the therapy, and it didn't take years. It took probably about 7 or 8 sessions. And what he learned was the idea, the belief that once poor, always poor. And he, as a kid, had vowed that he was going to be rich as an adult. So that's what he was trying to do. But the belief that he could never be not poor was so overwhelming that it was really steering his adult behavior. So once he realized that, like me, he went through a mourning period and kind of the shame of screwing up. But then he got on fire. He let the second business go, and he worked very hard in a diligent, efficient way to scale up the first business, and he became very successful.
Hmm. I mean, I think that's what I loved about Crazy About Money. So the book is called Crazy About Money: How Emotions Confuse Our Money Choices and What to Do About It. And I think that, I mean, you highlight in there how childhood influences our adult money decision. And that's a great example because nobody told him they were poor. He just made that connection in his tiny little brain, right? And then through his whole life kind of went with that thought. It's almost like a money script that resurfaced, from a while back. But there's so many things I want to talk about. I love this book. You talk about behavioral economics. You talk about there was a passage that I did want to talk about too, and we'll get to it, but mental accounting. What is behavioral economics?
Well, let me kind of zoom back here a minute. The traditional attitude was that what was called the efficient market theory, where people would do what was best for them, so that they would take a very logical approach to wins and losses. They would invest with a steady kind of factual mind. They wouldn't take hot stock tips from a cocktail party they just went to, or they wouldn't, gamble, or if they gambled, they'd, gamble with $50 and then walk out of the casino. And what Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who were really the founding fathers of behavioral economics, what they developed through very, very stringent research was that the emotions and the experience of risk and the potential experience of loss motivated much of financial behavior, so that people ended up doing very irrational things. Like, you have a love of wanting to make money and you get detached from it, and you go start a second business that takes your mind away from it, so you end up self-sabotaging. And that was the more familiar experience of investors than, oh, this is what I should do, follow a logical path, as if you were solving a math problem. But people's emotions are not mathematical.
No, very irrational. I mean, is that what motivated you to write Crazy About Money? Like, what was that? How did you get all those stories? Because it really is, if you've not read the book, I highly recommend it. It is chock full of stories that, like, for me, I'm more of a storyteller and a visual learner. And like, listening to these stories helps me kind of say, oh, I've done that. I do that, like that. So it's great because it's not like, do this, do that. It's like, okay, here's a good story. Like, why do people do that? So how did you get all these stories? Because people are sometimes very ashamed to talk about money, and you have a ton of stories in here.
Well, these are actual clients that I've worked with over the years, and I got a written permission from every one of them to use them in the book, obviously disguised. So they're true stories. I'm not spinning fiction here.
Yeah. Well, and I think that so the passage that I wanted to read, I think it's very appropriate for people when they're moving, because I can think of a situation that I know I was, when I lived in San Francisco, I was living in a place in the marina, and it was a great little rental, but it had its quirks. It was an old building, and the kitchen was incredibly old. There was, like, my refrigerator kept going out. It was from like the 1960s. It was terrible. And I spent the money to make a move and like pack up all my stuff and move to a different apartment. And I was like, oh, well, the apartment I was living in, and this is, 2003 to I think 2009, I was paying $2,200 a month for rent for a 1-bedroom. And because it had boomed through that time, when I left, they started charging like $5,000 for that same apartment. They didn't make any upgrades. They didn't do anything. But in my head, I was like, okay, I'm going to move into this other apartment down the street, and it's, got a better kitchen, and it seemed bigger, but it wasn't bigger. But I was saving like maybe $100 or $200 a month. So I justified all that stress and packing all my stuff up and paying for movers and all that stuff. And then I ended up getting transferred to New York City like 6 months later. So I never even recouped the money. So, but there's a chapter, there's a bunch of stuff that, in this book, there's a passage called mental accounting. And so I want to read this to you because I laughed out loud because I think that, this would be something for me. So imagine you bought a $150 ticket for a concert featuring your favorite group. At the arena, you realize you left the ticket at home. After hopping up and down, bemoaning your luck, and possibly yelling at your best friend for not reminding you to bring the ticket, would you spend another $150 to see that performance? Now imagine the same scenario, except that you planned to buy the ticket at the box office, but when you got there and pulled out your wallet, you realized you lost $150 somewhere in the parking lot. You still have more than enough cash to buy the ticket, but would you? Most people say they would buy another ticket if they lost the $150 in the parking lot, but not if they left the ticket at home. Why? It's mental accounting. And it goes on to say, if you had to buy a replacement ticket, which means you'd end up spending $300 on entertainment, the original ticket was $150 plus the second ticket. However, you lost the money in the parking lot, doesn't come out of your mental entertainment account. So you'd buy a ticket, even though the bottom line is that you still spent $300 for that ticket. So, I mean, it's like mental accounting is a sneaky way, it says, to protect yourself from the pain of loss. So that story, I was like, oh my gosh, let's talk about that what is mental accounting? Because this is such a funny concept to me.
Well, another it is where the money comes from has a deep emotional response. And I think the way you said it was terrific, where it's a means of trying to protect yourself from loss, or from conflict. And I'll give you another example that's in the book where the woman decided that she wanted to get some new clothes. So she goes out and she knows that her husband is pretty frugal and he doesn't want her spending a lot of money. So she goes out and she buys a dress for $150. And she puts $50 on one credit card, another $50 on a second credit card, and $50 on another one. So she goes home and she shows her husband the dress. And then she says, see, on my credit card, it's only $50. And, he's very pleased and she's very pleased until he realizes when he gets all of the bills that, in fact, this is $150. But in her mind, she was cleverly avoiding the conflict with her husband that ultimately had big consequences. But in the moment, it felt great.
Creative financing. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think we do that, especially if we want to move somewhere that, is maybe more expensive than what we're paying. And, you figure out ways to justify it, or even the opposite. A lot of people justify moving. So I lived in California for many years, and California has gotten incredibly, incredibly expensive to live. There's just no inventory. So the supply and demand is pretty great. And so a lot of, like myself, I didn't move to Florida per se, but I moved to the East Coast. And so the East Coasters, like a lot of my friends moved to Florida or they moved to Texas where, they may have had a $1 million house in California, but they came to Florida and that was a $500,000 house, so the expense of the move justified going. But sometimes that's mental accounting, right? That's the mental gymnastics that you play with yourself, but you still paid, $15,000, $20,000 to hire movers and to disrupt your whole life. And, you're in disarray for a year. And like, what is that worth?
Exactly. And the other thing is that and I'll go back to, I think I mentioned this in the beginning, if you have one or two things, maybe three things that were really stressful, most people can handle that. But
Mhm.
if you have 5 or 6 things that are stressful and uncertain, that is very, very, very difficult for people to handle, and then they start doing this mental accounting bit because the expenses are flying at them, and rather than throwing up their hands and saying, "I can't do this," and dissolving into a puddle,
Yeah.
they keep justifying, "Oh, well, this will happen. Don't worry, I can pay off the credit card. Yeah, I may have to have interest payments that I don't like, but it's so important for me to get to Florida that that's what I'm going to do." And then they sit down at some point and they realize how much it's cost them to move. And
Yep.
one of the things that behavioral economics really enlightened everybody about was the intensity of the emotional reaction to loss, which is about 2.5 times greater than a win, a positive win. And people don't realize this, and they get kind of either depressed or exceedingly anxious because they really are dealing with a deeply felt sense of loss that they didn't expect.
Well, I mean, even going back to the childhood example of, your entrepreneur that had the two businesses, there's something to be said for having to admit something is not working. And I think that the financial or like the shame that you go, there's so much shame attached to finances, and some of it, some people have shame around having too much money and some people have shame about not having enough. And then there's all the people in between. And, we talked. So Maggie and I, we ended up, we thought we were going to have like a 15-minute conversation prepping for this podcast. And we ended up talking for like almost an hour just about all the different, it was such a great conversation. I'm like, oh, I wish we recorded that for the podcast. But I mean, we talked a little bit. There's several different theories out there in financial coaches. And, you've got your Dave Ramsey's and your Susie Ormans who are very shame based and they feel like it's that tough love. And, if you don't have the money to pay off your mortgage or, pay off all your credit cards, you shouldn't be doing it. And I was a Dave Ramsey coach for a while. And I felt the resistance in that. It is very hot in my studio because I don't have air conditioning in here. So I run the air conditioning and then I turn it off for the thing. And so now it's starting to get humid again and I'm like sweating.
Oh,
Um, mm. But yeah, there's the shame based side of the financial coaching. And then there's the other side where it's like very methodical and consistent. So when you have clients come to you, how do you coach them through? Like, where does everybody just come and just vomit all of their financial problems on you, and then you have to pick up the pieces and figure it out, or what is that? What do you typically tell people to do?
I listen more than anything else. And then I say, we're going to take this at a pace that you can handle. Because getting locked in shame means that most people withdraw and stop reaching out. And so I outline, that this is something that piece by piece you can do much better with. And let's look at, why you're blaming yourself, because there are many reasons why people have trouble with money, and maybe you're being awfully hard on yourself. And with a more compassionate attitude, we'll make a lot more progress.
Mm,
So I try to break it down into manageable bits.
okay. If somebody, I mean, especially when you're moving, like it feels like you're just bleeding money. I mean,
Well,
you
that's
haven't
one of
moved
the
in.
advantages of Zoom is that you can have Zoom. With me, you can have Zoom sessions. So if you're
Yeah.
leaving California to go to Florida, if you stop in Arizona, we can still have a session.
Yeah. That's nice because a therapist has to be licensed in that state. So being a coach, having that designation is nice.
Well, it's interesting. I'm a licensed psychologist in Pennsylvania, but
Yeah.
there's no licensing for financial therapist. So that
Crazy.
frees me to go anywhere.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I mean, if somebody is because like I said, when you are moving, people don't realize, and this is what I try to prepare people for when we talk about finances. It's the least sexy thing I talk about. People really don't want to know. They're like, well, I'll just get boxes and I'll just, but I mean, you go to Home Depot and you buy 30 boxes and that's $300, So there's a lot of things. And then you got to buy tape and then you got to, there's so many things that are hidden sunk costs from a move and then if you're renting, you're putting first and last month's rent down in, your deposit, or, if you're buying a house, you're putting a deposit or you're putting your down payment down. And then you've got all of the everything else, like the closing costs and all that stuff. So when somebody's in that, completely overwhelmed by the financial aspect of what's happening in the moment, are there any things that they can do that just kind of, like keep it real, like, get to a better place? Like, what would you suggest?
Yeah,
It's paralyzing.
this is going to sound ridiculously simple, but I would teach deep breathing and meditating and getting to a place of calm through the breathing, which you can really do, and I can demonstrate that for you if you like. And then in a calmer state, sit down and strategize.
Okay.
What expenses list the expenses that you incurred that you didn't expect, like how much tape is, how much boxes are, and go through and list all that you've spent. And then if you're just beginning this process, you can say, okay, now where could I get tape cheaper, or where could I find boxes where I don't have to pay for them? So
Yeah.
you confront some of these things that you forget you're going to have to do. The other thing is talking to your bank manager. There are all kinds of ways that you might be able to get help from the bank in terms of if they demand certain amounts, you can spread it over time. Or just even talking to somebody in a bank and getting their advocacy, even if all they do is listen. It's calming, because what you need to do is calm down. And
Yeah.
that does not go with moving
No,
unless
I
you really
actually,
work at it.
yeah, I just, before our recording, I recorded with another woman named Saunders Moore, and she's a psychotherapist and deals with transitions. And that was one of the things, like your biology. People don't realize that it is a biological change in your body when you're transitioning. You're out of your routine. You could have fatigue and brain fog and all of these things that people don't associate that with the grief of a move. But you are grieving an old identity and you're grieving an old place, and you've got the loss of one routine, and then you're moving to a new routine that you don't actually know what it's like yet. So your body is in this like fight or flight, freeze kind of mode. So I can definitely identify with that. I love the idea of going to your bank. I mean, I know even with I bank with Chase, I'm seeing, do you want to spread these payments out? Like I never really thought about that. That's a great idea.
Well, they can be very helpful for sure. And they can also waive certain, if you get behind on something, and they
Yeah.
charge you a fee for being late, you can often get them to waive that fee. But if you never ask, they certainly aren't going to do it for you.
Right. That's how they make their money.
Exactly.
Oh, I love this. I am such a big proponent of your book. I absolutely have been loving it. I'm more than halfway through it. So I have a long drive after this. I'm going to go see Freakier Friday with my friend Stacy and her daughter. So I'm going to probably finish it in the next like 2 days, which I'm super excited about. But if somebody wants to coach with you, what is your website? How can they find you?
My website is maggiebakerphd.com, or I've got two. I've got crazyaboutmoney.net.
Okay.
And that's,
So
let
they
me
can,
repeat, because it's maggiebakerphd.com and or crazyaboutmoney.net. And if you go to one, it'll take you to the other, but you can independently go to each one if you want.
okay. So that's how they can find you to set up time to meet with you, right?
Yeah, on the maggiebakerphd.com, they can send me a comment in the
Okay.
comment.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think that this is going to be an eye opener for a lot of people because there is definitely a lot of childhood ways that we've learned that, follow us into adulthood. And, if we could be more rational in the decisions that we're making around big moves and big transitions, I think that it would be a lot less stressful because the money is the hard part. Everything else kind of follows. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Baker. It has been a wonderful experience.
Wonderful. Likewise, you're great to talk with, and I'm glad that you're highlighting the difficulties of moving, because there's something called the Holmes and Ray scale that gives points for change, and death, divorce, and moving are the top three for change. And
Ugh,
they're only, it may ultimately be a positive change, but it's a change.
yeah.
So I think everybody should be very, very compassionate with themselves and not let themselves fall into a shame spiral, and know that if they don't, they're increasing their resilience to issues.
And you're going to recover, right? I mean,
Oh,
if they're listening to
absolutely.
this podcast, yeah, if they're listening to this podcast today, you have survived 100% of things that have been thrown at you. So I'm confident that you can make it through there. It's just gonna stink for a little bit.
Yeah, if you remember the phrase, "This too shall pass."
Yes. We got to write it down and like tattoo it on your arm when you're actually going through a move.
Absolutely.
Well, awesome. Well, everybody go to maggiebakerphd.com or crazyaboutmoney.net and find Miss Baker. And I think you're going to get a lot of hits on this one because finances is definitely something people are interested. So thank you for being here.
Well, you're very, very welcome. I enjoyed it immensely.
Wonderful.
That's a wrap on today's tips and tricks. Jump on decidingtomove.com to apply for a free on-air coaching session or join the newsletter to get your copy of the Moving for Smarties workbook. Oh, and the legal stuff. This podcast is presented solely for educational and entertainment purposes. I'm a certified coach, not a licensed therapist, and this is not meant to replace the professional advice of a physician, psychotherapist, or real estate agent. I do not own a moving company or work for the governing agencies transporting home goods, which means Marriott's on the Move LLC is not responsible for anything that happens during your move. This is solely my perspective based on my research and my own experience and training. So, move at your own risk. Bye for now.